Hello, everybody. I am legitimately so excited. I'm so excited to see you all here. And I'm also very excited for our speaker. If I could have everybody's attention, please. Okay, thank you. Today we have Mr. Ivan Long. He is a senior principal seismologist at Atlantis Consultants International and is an internationally recognized expert in seismic hazard analysis with nearly 50 years of experience. He's directed evaluations of over 700 critical and important facilities, and has been involved in the largest ever seismic analysis performed in the US of the Yucca Mountain project that we were just talking about a little bit ago. Ivan has also helped with FEMA. He's been involved in education and implementation of seismic risk assessment software, HAZAS. He's also the recipient of 20 USGS and EHRP external research grants and have supported the development of urban probabilistic and seismic hazard maps and many other earthquake-related hazard studies. A major focus in Ivan's career has been just earthquake hazard reduction and awareness. He has spoken, taught, and lectured at hundreds of events, including this one. And yeah, at many such organizations. I lost my place, I'm sorry. Anyways, so we're tremendously excited to have Mr. Long here, so everybody please give him a big round of applause.
Thank you, Noah, and thanks for coming. This has to be one of the largest audience I've spoke to in one of these lectures, but I appreciate your time and hopefully I'll make it worthwhile. So I'm here on behalf of what's called the Friedman Family Visiting Professional Lectures. There's a group of about 15 of us. They're supported by the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. And we go around the country talking about our specialties. And UNR invited me to talk about my expertise, or what I propose to be my expertise, and that's seismic hazards. So I've been in the business a long time. I've been around the block multiple times. So what I'm going to talk about today is basically what I've learned in the last 50 years and how we apply that to both earthquake engineering and the seismic design of infrastructure, which is what I specialize in. So let's get started. Okay.
Well, if you click on the slides.
Click on which one? Click on
With the mouse, yeah. Oh,
oh,
there we go.
sorry, logistics. Okay, so I got to put a plug in for the program that I'm being supported by. It's Freeman Family Lectures, and again, we go around the country speaking at different universities, talking about our experience and hopefully to encourage the next generation of engineers and geoscientists, and encourage them to do what they love, which is basically engineering and other fields related to earthquakes. So Friedman Family gave an endowment to EERI. We also get support from FEMA. If you don't know about EERI, I would encourage you to be a member if you're interested in earthquake engineering. We're an international organization, about 2,100 members sprinkled throughout the world. And again, what we're trying to do is to improve our understanding of earthquake risk and increasing earthquake resilience around the world. So this is our mission. I'll let you read that. We're basically trying to achieve earthquake resilience around the world. So we're not just a US organization, but I think one would consider us a global organization because our interests are not just anchored here in the US, but elsewhere around the world, wherever earthquakes pose a hazard and risk. I'll just skip this so you can read it. We're a diverse organization, probably more diverse than other professional organizations. We're both geoscientists, engineers, but we're also public officials, social scientists, architects. Emergency management is a big part of our group. And we work not only from the practicing professionals, but also as individuals in government, researchers, academia, and even as regulators. Our flagship program is called Learning from Earthquakes. I hope that most of you have heard of the program. Whenever there's a significant earthquake, we will send a team and try to learn as much as we can about what we've learned from that specific earthquake and its implications to society. What I'm going to be talking about today is, in a large part, what I've learned as part of the LFE program about the significant earthquakes that I've managed to study or be involved in as part of a member of the EERI. For the younger folks, we have a travel study program where we'll have students, both graduate or undergraduate, participate in these LFE programs. Often we'll send a reconnaissance team out after the earthquakes, and the students and both graduate and undergraduate, have an opportunity working with side by side with practicing professionals and other scientists to learn what we can about that specific earthquake. Student membership, I'm going to put a plug in. As a student, you get a heavily discounted membership as being part of EERI. And then after you graduate, we also have membership benefits where we basically can be a member of EERI for several years as a young professional. We have regional chapters around the country. Closest chapter to here would be, I guess, the Sacramento or Northern California chapter. So hopefully you'll become interested in EERI. If you're interested in earthquakes, earthquake engineering, I think or an organization that would benefit your career and your career growth. Okay, so over the almost half a century, I have to say, of my experience, the way I've seen earthquake science and earthquake engineering evolve is it evolves in a series of steps. And every time, and each one of those steps represents a significant earthquake. And that's the way the science and engineering has basically evolved. We have research where we, the UN, in particular in the US, where research continues and continues. But really where I think we see sort of the big steps in our understanding of earthquakes is whenever we have a significant earthquake. Every significant earthquake that I've ever been involved in, we have always learned something new. There's never been a significant earthquake where we said, oh, we've seen that over and over. There's always something in the, some aspect of the earthquake, either in the science or the engineering that we learn about. And of course, the hope here is to take what we learn and integrate it into practice so that we can build safer buildings and that we can look in particular at our existing infrastructure and make sure that it's currently safe under the current framework of our understanding. So I'm only going to take you back roughly how many years? 30 years to the first significant earthquake that I was involved in. And the bottom line is, with an increased understanding, we can provide a better ability to predict the earthquake hazards and their effects on buildings and infrastructure. And we can develop means to develop adequate seismic design and or seismic reevaluation of the ground shaking in particular. Okay, so I'm going to go through very quickly. The first significant earthquake was the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which I was in. And I'll tell you about my experience. And I'm going to briefly go through some of these earthquakes and give you a snippet of what I think what we learned in terms of seismic hazards and how we apply it in design. You all know this, but I'm going to do some 101 for you. When we talk about earthquake hazards, of course, we're talking about strong ground shaking. Surface faulting, you happen to be near the causative fault, and the fault is expressed to the surface. There's a chance that there may be surface faulting. So in particular, some of the earthquakes in Turkey and Taiwan buildings have been built to strike active faults. And of course, if you have a large earthquake, then you can get 1 to 3 to 5 meters of displacement. Not many structures can withstand that type of displacement. In really large earthquakes, we can see subsidence or outflow. This is particularly true of the large earthquakes which occur on subduction zones, where we see areas along the coast that can be uplifted or subsided by several meters. I'm looking forward to seeing that in the Pacific Northwest in my lifetime. Actually, I was just kidding. Secondary hazards are ground failure, liquefaction, which you all know about, earthquake-induced landslides, and tsunamis. I'll talk about the Indonesian earthquake, which was probably the most impactful earthquake that I've seen recently in the last 30 years, without a doubt. Okay, I want to clarify some terms, because even in the engineering, within the engineering community, there is this misunderstanding or this misuse of terminology. And that is when someone's talking about seismic risk hazard versus when someone's talking about seismic risk. Seismic hazard is the impact of the earthquake, the direct effect of the earthquake. Ground shaking is a hazard. Seismic risk, again, people use that interchangeably, is the consequence of that hazard. So when we talk about seismic risk, we're talking about loss or damage. And that is basically can be defined as the convolution of both hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So there is a big difference between seismic hazard and seismic risk. So please, when you use those terms, make sure you're using them within the right context. Well, when we talk about vulnerability, that can be usually expressed as what we call damage or loss function. I'll talk about that later. Now, high hazard doesn't necessarily equate to high seismic risk. Let me give you an example. California, we have a high seismic hazard. We do not have a high seismic risk. And that's because California, probably of most of the states in the US, has had more advanced earthquake engineering in the last 5 or 6 decades. So we have buildings that are generally well designed and well engineered. And so and that includes bridges or any other type of infrastructure. So if we would have a big earthquake, I would expect the vast majority of our modern structures to do very well. Our problem is that we also have older structures that are built pre-code, pre-building code. Those will be the ones that we're worried about. So in California, we're not worried about our modern buildings. We're worried about the pre-existing inventory of vulnerable structures. So in California, we have a high hazard, but I would say we have a relatively low risk. In the central part of the US, there's an area called New Madrid. The hazard there is, I would say, moderate, but the risk is very high. And that's because around New Madrid, Missouri, Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Illinois, seismic design has not been really addressed except for the last 20 years. So we have a very large inventory of existing structure, not only buildings, but bridges. Our schools are in terrible shape in the central and eastern US. So we have a moderate hazard, but we have a very high risk in the central and eastern areas. Then you can apply these lessons anywhere around the world. Again, high hazard doesn't necessarily equate to high risk. Okay, exposure, when we talk about exposure, we're talking about, what are we talking about in terms of inventory of structures that may be subject to damage or loss, as well as the loss of life or injury. So the size of the impacted population is a significant factor. Having a big earthquake here in downtown Reno is not the same as having a big earthquake in Winnipeg, okay? Because the amount of population that will be impacted is quite different. And I would say this, well, I shouldn't say that because I haven't worked in Reno that much, but my guess is the inventory of structures is better than it is over in central Utah. What I've seen just walking around Reno over the last few decades, there's still a lot of vulnerable structures, a lot of brick and URM that I don't think are gonna do very well. Even in California, we still have vulnerable structures, but we're trying to do something about it. We've done pretty well in terms of our URM, or unreinforced masonry structure. But we still have soft-story buildings that we're trying to fix. We have non-ductile concrete buildings, concrete tilt-ups, and older tall buildings. And these are buildings that represent the exposure throughout the world. Okay, just a short tutorial on ground shaking, because that's what I'm going to be concentrating on. Okay, so the ground shaking you feel on a site is a function of three different categories of effects. One, obviously, is the earthquake source. How big is the earthquake in terms of magnitude? You know, we know earthquakes are the result of rupture on faults. How big is the fault? The amount of shaking and the characteristics of shaking differs where you are on that fault. Faults are not homogeneous, you know, planes of failure. They differ in terms of where the strong ground shaking will be. When you have a large fault that can generate a magnitude 7, these are faults that are generally on the order of 30 or 40 kilometers long and about 30 kilometers wide. The places where the strong shaking can be generated are what we call asperities. And these are places on the fault that represent places where the fault is very strong. But once that strong point of the fault breaks, it will generate the strongest amount of high frequency or moderate frequency ground shaking. So if you're in the near field of a fault, where you are relative to that fault will make a difference in terms of the characteristics of the ground shaking. So, and the type of fault makes a difference. If it's a reverse fault or a strike slip, or here in Nevada, mainly normal faults, that will have an impact on the level of ground shaking. Where the earthquake starts makes a difference. In the 1989 earthquake, the center of the fault, where the hypocenter was, where the earthquake originated, was in the middle of the fault. And so the rupture of the fault proceeded both to the north towards San Francisco and to the south towards the Santa Cruz area. If that earthquake had started at the very southern end, we would have seen substantial more damage in San Francisco than we did. So where the earthquake starts and how that rupture process is really important. Once the seismic waves are generated, about 95% of the energy that comes out of an earthquake, you never see. That 95% is generated in heat and basically is taken up along the fault plane. Only less than 5% of the energy coming from an earthquake is transmitted in seismic waves. Those seismic waves travel through the earth, and then they get to your site. And I know there's a lot of site response people here. It's the property of the site that can amplify or, in some cases, de-amplify. So knowing the site properties of your site are important, and in being able to predict, you know, what the amplification is going to be. Is the ground shaking going to be enhanced, or is it going to be de-amplified? So shear wave velocity profiles, or the shear wave velocity structure, the dynamic properties of the site. Basins are a big deal because they can amplify ground motions. You know you're sitting on a basin where, I mean, folks here at UNR are trying to understand basin effects. I don't think we have a good handle, honestly, about the basin effects in Reno. But if there were a big earthquake on the Genoa Fault outside of town, we're going to see basin amplification. The tall buildings in the city are going to be impacted. But I don't think we have a good understanding of how strong that shaking might be. So basin effects are really important. Okay, 1989 earthquake. We call it the World Series earthquake because it occurred when the Giants were playing in the World Series, playing the Oakland Athletics. It was about 5:02. I was standing in my doorway, and I was thinking about what I was going to have for dinner that night. And the P wave hit. So we have a lot of earthquakes in California. I said, oh, okay, it's another magnitude 3 on the Hayward Fault. So then I went back to think about what I was going to have for dinner. But the problem is that P wave kept on going. and it kept on going. And then, probably about 7 seconds after the P wave hit, the S wave hit. And then I knew I was in trouble. I knew I was in trouble because I was in a 3-story building, only 3-story building, but very flexible. And I started seeing everything moving. The windows were shaking, and I could see my bookshelf, and I was in charge of making sure the bookshelves were anchored, and I hadn't got around to it. And I was watching my bookshelf, and I was seeing all those ASCE journals and BSA journals, and they started flying off my bookshelf. That's how severe it was. And eventually the bookshelf fell. I unfortunately had closed the door and I couldn't get out of my office. But thankfully a friend who didn't have a bookshelf fell, he managed to pry open my door and remove the bookshelf when I got out. So that was my second experience with a big earthquake. But my office was located 2 miles from the seismic structure that's shown in the upper left-hand corner. That was the site of the largest amount of casualties. There are about, let me see, what was it, 60-something, 62 deaths. 45 deaths were from that collapsed freeway structure. That's why we pay a lot of attention to bridges now. So in that earthquake, only 62 deaths, but we learned a lot of. That was the biggest earthquake since the 1971 San Fernando earthquake. At the time, it was a disaster in terms of economic losses. What's interesting is that earthquake occurred in the Santa Cruz Mountains. That was 60 miles away I was 60 miles away from the epicenter. And most of the significant damage was in San Francisco and Oakland, 60 miles away. Between where the epicenter was and where I was in Oakland, there was damage, but it was moderate damage. But I would say 70–80% of the damage was in Oakland and San Francisco. And what happened is something that we had never really learned about is that the seismic waves from the earthquake, they went down and they bounced off what we call the mohole, which is a boundary in the crust that separates the crust and the mountain. The seismic waves went down and they bounced back up. So they got reflected off the mohole. And we, unfortunately, at 60 miles away, happened to be the place where the ground shaking came up. So if those seismic waves had not bounced off the mohole, we would have seen the damage we saw in San Francisco and Oakland. That was just, first of all, it was an amazing occurrence to see this. This is the first earthquake that I'm aware of where that bounced wave had caused such large destruction. Other things we learned. Everybody thought the earthquake occurred on San Andreas Fault. It occurred next to the San Andreas Fault, but it didn't occur on the San Andreas Fault. It occurred on a blind fault. So again, we were seeing strong ground shaking and liquefaction, lots of liquefaction. I live on an island in the San Francisco Bay. I live on fill. Guess who saw a lot of liquefaction firsthand? Me. Thankfully, the firm that did the engineering of my foundation happened to be the firm that I worked for, so I made sure that it was well engineered. But there were a lot of areas on my island where there's substantial liquefaction. Lots of soft soil amplification, as you would expect. Relatively short duration. If the earthquake had been longer, it would have been more damaging. But it was relatively short duration because, as I said, it started in the middle of the earthquake and propagated up in north. Extensive surface faulting. And I got to move along. I'm going too slow. Northridge, important earthquake. See the number of deaths, $20 billion in damage. An earthquake that we knew could occur in the Los Angeles Basin, but we didn't know what fault it occurred on. We had some inkling that there was what we call blind fault. In other words, a fault that is not expressed at the surface, but we were surprised there was this particular blind fault. So blind fault, it's not expressed at the surface. You would expect that there's some maximum magnitude cap on it. It was a 6.7. People think of it as an urban earthquake. It wasn't, because it was on the north side of the basin. If that earthquake had occurred further to the south in downtown LA, we were seeing probably an order of magnitude damage than we saw in that earthquake. Interesting, this earthquake showed us that ground motions in the vertical sense could be very high, in excess of 1 G. Engineering, the common engineering thought was, well, we don't need to worry about vertical ground motions, right? Because it's the horizontal resistance that we need to worry about. But if you're very close to the source, then the vertical ground motions can exceed the horizontal ground motion. So our rule of thumb was to get the vertical motions, you would multiply by 2/3. Well, in Northridge, you multiply by 1.3. Okay, so vertical motions, I think, we haven't paid sufficient attention to, and that I think is particularly true when we talk about tall buildings, particularly buildings that have an asymmetric shape. Vertical motions can be very important. Oh, Kobe earthquake, you see the damage. First really important example of what we call fault rupture directivity, where the earthquake starts and the seismic waves move out, and where the rupture proceeds in the same direction, you get sort of a Doppler effect where you get reinforced ground motion. The Kobe earthquake was south of the city of Kobe, and basically when the earthquake occurred, it was like looking down a gun barrel. And so all the energy was directed towards the city. So you have this fault rupture directivity. If you looked at the buildings in Kobe, it was the buildings that were most heavily damaged were anywhere from 5 to 7 stories. And that's because their fundamental period was basically coincided with the period of the rupture pulse that was in the forward rupture directivity. Lots of liquefaction in the port facilities, surface faulting, and as you would expect for a city that's sitting along marine sediments, there's a lot of a lot of soft soil amplification. This is a typical building, Kobe, 6 stories high, where its fundamental period coincided with the period of the pulse that was in the seismic magnitude of fault rupture directivity. Chichi earthquake, anybody see where the fault is? So this was a track, a high school track, and you see that sort of the hillock, basically fault went through the track, and you see where the fault, it's a reverse fault. So the side on the left moved up relative to the fault, and the side on the other side of the fault moved downward. So that produced that fault scarp that we're seeing here. Surface faulting was very dramatic in Chichi. You see the statistics. It was a very long fault, 90 kilometers long. Vertical displacements got up to be 8 meters vertical. So you can imagine if you have a building on a scarp that goes 8 meters, well, I guess your view improves, but your building doesn't do very good. Ground motions on the order, not really that high, 0.3 to 0.5 G, not like we saw in Northridge, but still very damaging. Widespread liquefaction, in particular in areas where there's fill and inland alluvial areas. Lots of landslides. If you looked at a landside image of Taiwan, all you would see, it was like a puzzle where there was a landslide every 100 meters. It's very dramatic. This is a lesson in doing adequate site characterization before you build infrastructure. So the fault went through the abutment of this dam, and the fault moved and it collapsed this portion of the dam. So if they had done their homework, they would have known they're putting a dam across an active fault. Not a good idea. Okay, Christchurch, typical lessons. Oh, this was an interesting sequence of earthquakes. So there were 2 earthquakes. The Darfield earthquake, 2010, I think it was a magnitude 7.1 or 7.2, maybe a little higher. And Christchurch is shown by that red star. You can see over there. In the red, well, that's the epicenter, sorry. Christchurch is over on the coast, over by the harbor. The green star is the Darfield earthquake. It caused some damage in Christchurch, but what really knocked Christchurch out was the second earthquake, the aftershock, which was what we call the Christchurch earthquake. And basically the earthquake was situated underneath the city. So it wasn't the larger earthquake that caused all the damage in this sequence, but it was the smaller Christchurch earthquake was a magnitude 6.3. So if you've been to New Zealand, seismic design is very advanced. The practice of earthquake engineering in New Zealand is very advanced. But still, this was, I think, not so much a wake-up call, but this was a good example of what happens when you have what I will call an urban earthquake, an earthquake that occurs right beneath the city, where the strong ground shaking can be really intense because you're so close to the earthquake. Liquefaction, I think this was the PGC building, which was the site of most of the deaths. This was a relatively modern structure that just, yeah, for some reasons, I don't know exactly why, but either the design or the construction, but it did not do very well. And a result, large number of deaths. One of the things New Zealand learned is that their building code needed to be improved based on what they saw in the Christchurch earthquake. This just shows the building code, the standard code design. One is for 500 years, which is what the building was based on. The higher black code design is for 2,500 years. And you can see the actual recorded ground motions in downtown Christchurch. And you can see how the red spectrum, which is the recorded ground motion, how it exceeded the building code. The green spectrum is from the Darfield earthquake, which again was farther away. Liquefaction, big problem. We just had a engineer come in the other day who just had lived in Christchurch, was part of the sort of the rebuilding of the city, and he showed us some photos, and still the city has a long ways to go to recover from this earthquake. And again, in a society that has really good earthquake engineering practice. Tohoku earthquake, magnitude 9 earthquake. This was an earthquake that came as a big surprise to the Japanese government. The Japanese government, in particular, in the licensing of the Fukushima reactor, the maximum earthquake they felt that occur on the subduction zone in Japan was 8.5. Well, this earthquake was a magnitude 9. So they had underestimated the maximum magnitude of the earthquake. The issue was there were some geologists who had years ago suggested that the subduction zone could be larger than 8.5. They had looked at what we call paleo-tsunami deposits, and they had noticed deposits from a previous earthquake around 1100, 1200. If they back calculated the earthquake size, and they said this is going to be larger than 8.5. Unfortunately, the officials in charge did not take their science seriously enough. And a result, instead of an 8.5, we had a 9. We had a large tsunami. We had a failure of a nuclear facility. It was, Japan's worst disaster since the 1923 Tokyo earthquake. A lot of casualties. Different than most earthquakes, they had more than 16,000 casualties, and 90% of them drowned from the tsunami. An interesting, significant observation of this earthquake, of the 16,000 people that died, and that's probably an underestimate, something like 60% of the people were over 50 years old. Can anybody tell me why? Why was the vast majority of the people that drowned over 50 years old? Anybody want to guess? Because they couldn't run fast enough. As it turns out, Japan is very good at having tsunami evacuation center. And so the idea is when the strong ground shaking is, you run uphill. There's two things wrong with that. Well, they were high enough for the older folks like me could run fast enough to get to tsunami evacuation. The second thing is because they underestimated the size of the earthquake, all the, no, I won't say all, but something like 80% of the tsunami evacuation shelters were overcome by the tsunami. Huge mistake, but we learned. Okay, why am I going slow? Sorry. Turkey, Syria earthquakes, most recent earthquakes, pretty devastating. 7.8, followed by 9 hours later by 7.7. That's what I call a healthy earthquake sequence. So we're looking at a very large death toll, 50,000 in Turkey, 6,000 in Syria. The highest intensity we have on our scale, modified Mercalli scale, was 12. And there were areas in Turkey where we hit that. Widespread damage, simply because there were 2 large earthquakes. This is by far the deadliest earthquake in this century. I take that back. It's either the first or second deadliest earthquake. The first earthquake may have been the Indonesian earthquake, where we still don't know the amount of casualties that occurred in that earthquake. Simply because a lot of the deaths occurred on coastal areas in Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, where we don't know the exact death toll from the tsunami. That earthquake, almost, if you were to choose a perfect place to have a devastating earthquake, that earthquake, the Indonesian earthquake, was probably it. Because once the tsunami was generated, it basically hit all the coastal areas around that area of the Pacific and Indian Ocean, where we have large numbers of vulnerable population that were, basically living on the coast. Again, hazardous and triggered earthquakes of very large magnitudes. The impacts we saw in this earthquake are basically the same impacts we saw in other Turkish earthquakes. Strong ground shaking, amplification, liquefaction, subsidence. We even saw a small tsunami in the bay. And as expected, the buildings behaved as we expect. That's poor, both due to seismic design and or construction. So if I have time, I want to show this. This is a friend of mine who was on the reconnaissance team. And this is, I can't remember the name of the city, but he was basically just driving down the city, and you can see how the variation in how buildings behave. Some buildings, although heavily damaged, still were standing up. That's what our building code tries to do. Other cases, either due to poor design or poor construction or combination of both, they pancaked, and that's where we saw the largest amount of deaths. It looks like a city that got bombed, and this is just due to an earthquake. One of the people don't think about this, but other than the direct impacts that are on the population in terms of deaths, injuries, you lose your home. One of the big impacts that I've learned in doing risk analysis is that getting rid of all this damaged material, where do you put it? I mean, I'm sure they found places to put it, but there's a lot of concrete that needs to be moved out. It's going to take Turkey a long time, probably well over 10 years to fully recover. And I doubt it's going to recover after 10 years. So this is a good lesson where a good engineer comes in, but the engineer, you can build a safe building by design, but it's your responsibility also to make sure that the construction of the building is sound. A good design doesn't help you if it's poorly built, okay? Okay, I'm gonna skip a few things because I'm talking too long. Talk a little about hazard analysis. The way our building code is based on what we call probabilistic seismic hazard analysis. And what we're trying to do is estimate what the level of ground shaking will be, given some probability. So in the US, our building code is based on ground shaking that is based on what we call return period, which is basically 2,475 years, or an annual probability of 1 in 2,475. Our building code in the US used to be based on 475 years, or 1 in 475. We amped that up because we felt our building code was inadequate for the central and eastern US. And so we amped it up to a return period of 1 in 2,475. However, because this was giving too high a ground motions in California, the building code, we decided to multiply it by 2/3. And just because of the shape of the hazard curves, it still provides added protection in the CUS, but basically in California, it brings our design levels back to 475. So in a probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, what we're trying to do is make our buildings to withstand ground shaking that has an estimated probability of occurring of 1 in 2,475 multiplied by 2/3. For our nuclear power plants or dams, we're looking at an annual probability of 1 in 10,000. So we build our nuclear power plants and we build our, critical dams to a return period of 1 in 10,000 years. That's generally the ceiling in which we, look at our infrastructure. One of the issues with our building code, our building code is based on the National Seismic Hazard Maps, which are probabilistic maps. One of the issues with our probabilistic maps is that they are time independent. Let me explain that. What I mean by time independent is when we do a probabilistic seismic hazard analysis, we're looking at all the sources of earthquakes. That's primarily quaternary faults. And we want to characterize their magnitude and how often the earthquakes will occur in the faults. We don't consider when the last earthquake was. So in our national hazard maps and our building code, the earthquake could have occurred 10 years ago. It didn't make a difference. It doesn't make a difference in our building code. Or it could have occurred 5,000 years ago. It doesn't make a difference. We assume everything is Poissonian, so we don't consider the time dependence of our building code. So I've been in the last 5 years working with the USGS to change that. I'll give you a good example. I just finished a study in Anchorage, Alaska. Our big earthquake was in 1964 in Anchorage. It was a 9.2 earthquake called the Prince William Sound earthquake that occurred in 1964. So it's been what, 36, 24, 50 years since that earthquake. The average recurrence intervals, or the time between big earthquakes on the source of the big 1964 earthquake is like 5,000 years. I can't remember the exact number, I forgot. So we don't consider that earthquake was only 50 years ago. I would argue that I don't think we're going to see a 1964 earthquake, given what we know about the source. But we don't consider that in our earthquake building code, and we should. In Utah, where I work a lot, the average interval between our big earthquakes in Utah is about 1,400 years. We have two sections of the fault where it's either 1,400 years have elapsed or 2,500 years. So there are portions of the Wasatch Fault that we're going to have a big earthquake. Who knows when, but maybe in the next, I'm guessing the next few decades, we're going to have a big earthquake. Our building code doesn't account for that. Our building code assumes that, it doesn't care when the most recent earthquake is. So the USGS in the next set of hazard maps, at least, maybe not in the building code yet, but we're going to be starting looking at time-dependent hazard, because it makes a difference. Oh, here's the Wasatch, and I was just talking about the Wasatch. I'm going to skip that. Site response analysis. Site response analysis, I think, is an area that has not been fully appreciated in the engineering community. We do it. We've done it for decades, but I don't think we appreciate how different, what the impact could be of site response analysis. So let me give you an example. when we do hazard analysis, we use what are called ground motion models. Ground motion models relate magnitude, distance, site condition, sometimes the style of faulting to what the ground shaking would be. So you have a magnitude 7, is 10 kilometers away. Our ground motion models will tell you what the ground shaking is. Okay? We have now, before in the old days, when I first started, our ground motion models were, oh, is it a rock site or is it a soil site? We didn't discriminate other than it was a rock site or a soil site. Well, you can have a large range of amplification in soil sites, right? You can have a very soft soil site, you can have a firm soil site, the amplification is going to be really different. So our ground motion models, we're trying to consider side effects, and so what we came up with this proxy we call VS30. Anybody heard of VS30? Okay, it's the time average shear wave velocity in the top 30 meters. It's not a physical property of the ground, like it many engineers think it is. It is not a physical property of the ground. It's a proxy. We use that proxy to accommodate side effects. But a lot of times when people do hazard analysis, they'll say, oh, I'll go measure my shear wave velocity. VS30 is 300 meters per second, I'm done. The problem is that VS30 in the ground motion models is built on a set of shear wave velocity profiles that your site may not look at all like. So often I will see someone calculating VS30 and doing ground motion models. I will do a site response analysis and my site amplification will be 100% higher. The engineering community has not appreciated that fact. When you use VS30, it's okay to use it if your shear wave velocity profile looks like what's in the ground motion models. If it's not what's in the ground motion models, you dang well better do site response analysis, because amplification can be, well, when you look at all the earthquakes that I talked about, site amplification is, other than tsunamis, is accounting for a good part of the casualties that we see because we underestimate side effects. So I'll get off my soapbox right now. Okay, I want to finish up with talking about work that I've done in the Basin range and talk about, just talk about hazards in the Basin range. I mean, when we think of earthquakes, we think a lot about California, and now we're thinking about the Pacific Northwest of the Cascade subduction zone. But earthquake hazards in the Basin range, and Basin range is basically all of Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Idaho, Western Colorado, New Mexico. When we think of Basin range, we've had some big earthquakes. Now, it's been a while since we had a big earthquake. Last one was the Bora Peak earthquake, 1983. That was probably our last big earthquake. But we've had some big earthquakes, particularly here in Nevada. So just to list some of the earthquakes that have occurred in the Basin range. We've had a 7.5 earthquake occur in 1887, just south of the border. I do a lot of work in southern Arizona where we have to consider this earthquake. I don't think it's going to occur anytime soon in a time-dependent manner, but in a time-independent manner is something that we should consider. 1915 Pleasant Valley earthquake, 1971 Cedar Mountain earthquake, Dixie Valley, Fairview Peak. Where are all these earthquakes occurring? Right? And we don't know, I don't think, but I'll ask some of my expert geologists up there that work here. Can we expect a big earthquake to occur in Nevada, in the central Nevada seismic zone? I don't think we know. This is from corrective poles up there. This just shows where most of the earthquake activity is in Nevada. It's along the Walker Lane, which borders the California Nevada border, the central Nevada belt, which is that belt that has all the big earthquakes in it, like 1915. And then there's a smaller belt of seismicity that extends into Utah. So we've had some big earthquakes here in Nevada. Thankfully, they've been all to the east, where there's not a whole lot of population. Not to say that there's no one out there, but there's not a whole lot of population. But the potential for large earthquakes in Nevada is not just relegated to Central Nevada seismic zone. A lot of studies have been done by my colleagues up there, looking at the faults around Reno, along the Walker Lane. There's a lot of quaternary faults out there that have the potential for producing 927 earthquakes. This is an intensity map which basically shows the extent of shaking in the 1972 earthquake. As you can see, that was a magnitude 7.1 earthquake, but that earthquake generated ground shaking that we on the, not me, I was around 1932, although close. People on the coast of California could feel that earthquake. That's how big it was. This is the 1887 earthquake, which occurred just south of Arizona. Again, it was a magnitude 7.5 earthquake. It was felt as far south as Mexico City. Very big earthquake, a very impressive scar. The length of the earthquake is at least 75 kilometers. I think it's probably underestimated. I don't think we have to worry about this earthquake anytime soon, but there are other faults in Sonora, Mexico that we do. Okay, come on. He quit on me, maybe because he wants me to stop talking. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, in addition to really large earthquakes that occur on these map faults, we have what we call background earthquakes. These are earthquakes that occur on buried faults. These are either faults that, well, in faults that we don't know about because they have no surface expression. And so the geologist has to be able to find it. So these are earthquakes that can be very damaging. The Wells earthquake, in particular, was only a magnitude 6 earthquake. It was very damaging to the town of Wells. So then, when we do hazard analysis, we not only have to worry about earthquakes that occur on these well-known quaternary faults that are mapped, but we have to worry about earthquakes occurring on faults we don't even know about. This is, I've been doing some work in Western Nevada, just some of the earthquake, just compiling some of the earthquakes that have occurred in the region. And I'm gonna. Why is it?
If
I
you
need your magic touch.
click on the left screen, it gets angry.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna skip this for the social time. Okay, I want to wrap up with just talking about my observations of hazard in the Basin region. More than just Nevada, but with some focus on Nevada. So in the Basin Range, we have some really, fairly large cities. Phoenix, you can see the amount of population. Reno at almost 500,000 people. So although in the Basin Range, when you look at the distribution of population, there are large areas where there's no one out there except for the cows. But by and large, when you look at this list of cities in the Basin Range, 85% of them have a quaternary fault, either going through the city, like in Salt Lake City, or there's a nearby fault that's going to generate ground shaking. That's particularly true of the Reno Sparks area. We know there are some quaternary faults that are going to damage, generate strong ground shaking. People don't know about El Paso, but El Paso is a quaternary fault that goes right on the edge of the city. And it has almost a million people. Salt Lake City, of course. Salt Lake City is probably the area that we are most concerned about because we have earthquakes that are going to occur in the next few decades. I think we're going to have a large earthquake along the Wasatch Fault. Albuquerque, New Mexico sits in what we call the Rio Grande Rift. It's tectonically, volcanically, seismically active area, faults all over the place. A lot of adobe structures, a lot of adobe buildings. They're not going very, very well. Phoenix is probably pretty good. There are some quaternary faults out there, but of all the Basin Range, city, Phoenix is probably the best off. Not to say that it's going to be immune. I just listed these. I took the ground motions off the 2023 National Hazard Maps just to show. So 2% 50 years, which return period 24 to 75. Salt Lake City will have a PGA 0.72. Reno is next at 0.63 G. So you guys are in second place. You want to go first? Provo, Orem, 0.56, and then we go down. Las Vegas, 0.22. Not a seismic. Still capable of having some strong ground shaking there. Yeah, so the hazard of the basin range varies, by at least a factor of 10, as you consider, all areas of the, basin range. So, just to wrap it up, our geologic studies, our paleoseismic studies, our seismologic studies tell us there are active faults in the basin range, particularly in the urban areas, that are capable of generating at least earthquakes of magnitude 6.7. Now, although some of these faults have very long recurrence intervals, and what I mean by long, I mean thousands to 10,000 years, you know, given the number of faults that are in the basin range, and the relatively high rates of earthquakes, basin range is not immune. We're going to see a large, you folks will probably see a large earthquake in your lifetime, somewhere in the basin range. And I think we need to do a better job of paying attention to seismic design, and particularly looking at our existing inventory structures when it comes to earthquakes here in the greater basin range area. And again, many of the urban population centers are right next to the fault. So you're going to see near fault ground shaking. Many of the metropolitan areas are located in valleys. So there's deep sediments. They're located next to lakes, rivers, or mountain ranges. We don't put our cities unless there's a source of water nearby, or if there's good farming areas. And these are areas where there's usually substantial threat from ground shaking. So there's a range in seismic risk when it comes within the basin range, but a lot of that risk is focused in our urban areas. And given that a lot of the cities in the basin range have very old inventory buildings, particularly URMs, I think that represents a big risk. Some of the fastest growing regions are Salt Lake, Denver, Phoenix. These are some of the fastest growing areas, particularly of high tech. And yet, you know, that's where our seismic risk is. Building codes, I talked a little about building codes. I can skip that. These are the new maps that came out last year. I serve on the steering committee for the National Seismic Hazard Model. It's a really good model. It works for building codes, works for regular buildings. I would not use the National Seismic Hazard maps if I was building a dam or any other type of infrastructure. If I was doing performance-based engineering, I would probably not use, no, I would not use the National Seismic Hazard maps. I would do a site-specific analysis. That previous slide was for 0.2 seconds. Here I'm looking at 5 seconds. So if I'm looking at a tall building or a bridge, I'm more concerned with long period ground motions than I am with short period. Skip this because we're running out of time. FEMA has just released a report that shows annualized earthquake losses, which basically, you know, if you take a specific the input from National Seismic Hazard maps and you put that on your annual basis and you stick that into a risk program like HAZIS, it will tell you what the earthquake losses will be. And this is for this includes both buildings and economic loss. So you can see Nevada and Utah are not California, they're not Oregon or Washington, but they're the next round down. So look at Nevada and Utah, and then look at probably the area that has the worst or the highest seismic risk, and that's around the New Madrid zone. So Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, Kentucky. So you guys are probably on par in terms of risk as New Madrid. This is what we call earthquake loss ratios. This is basically where we take the annualized earthquake losses, and then we divide that by what we think it will take to reconstruct the same building. So you have a damaged building, how much is going to cost to replace that building? That's what we call by annual earthquake loss ratios. And when you look at Nevada and Utah, you guys, for some reason, and I'm not sure, maybe just, I don't know why, but you now are sort of in the second tier where you join Oregon and Washington in terms of AELRs. Okay, summarize, finally, I'm going to summarize. So Although large basin range earthquakes occur infrequently in any given area, because they have long recurrence intervals, the seismic hazard here is very real. And it needs to be considered in seismic design and seismic reevaluation of buildings, facilities, and structures. A large part of what I do is looking at pre-existing structures, not new structures. I look at our dams. Some of our dams, particularly in California, are 50 years old. And when they should be able to stand ground shaking on the order of 1G, they've been designed to 0.1 G. So, yeah, seismic risk is higher in the urban areas because of, again, existing inventories of vulnerable buildings, and they were built before the modern building code. Conducting geologic studies, like my friends Craig and Rich up there, is important to understanding the earthquake record. We need to extend the earthquake record on these quaternion faults so we can do a better job in a time-dependent manner of finding out when we expect the next big earthquake to occur. We have strong motion data, which is really important, so we get ground motion records that we can do is in structural design and hazard analysis. Problem is that most of the strong instruments are concentrated like in Utah, some along Reno, Nevada, but we have a sparse covering of the strong motion instruments, and we need them in areas where we may not expect the highest risk is, but we need good earthquake records close into some of these big earthquakes. Okay, I talked about for critical facilities, need to pay attention to site geology, need to pay attention to basin effects. If you're in the hanging wall of a fault, which you are in Reno, I think, certainly in Wasatch, with the hanging wall of the faults, we have to be careful. Talked about the seismic hazard maps, how they are, they don't give you real-time hazard estimates, they give you Poissonian estimates of hazard. So I know, and I've encouraged USGS, and they are doing this, going and doing real-time hazard maps. So our state of knowledge in the US is really rapidly evolving, but it's imperative that we use this knowledge and that knowledge be translated into sound engineering practice. Thank you. Any questions?
Oh, I see one in the back there. Go ahead.
Yep, yes.
Craig, you can't ask a question. Go ahead, Craig.
Variability of fault behavior. I'm wondering about using time considerations on lowering the hazard, where you did use the example of Anchorage. It almost seems like you're gonna have a yo-yoing of ground motion that potentially would go up and come down and things like that. How comfortable, and I assume what you're doing is prorating, you're saying the 9.6 or whatever, 9.2, whatever it was, won't occur anymore, not for a long time. Therefore, we're gonna look at a B-value curve or something, and we're gonna pick a magnitude off of that or something like that. We're gonna say that's what we're gonna design for. I'm just a little concerned that that's an over-interpretation, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, I don't, well, I do disagree with you, but you're in the same boat I think a lot of engineers. Engineers don't want to see the building go up and down, right? They don't want to know that they designed a building last year and the USGS comes out, the building code gets changed, and the hazard goes up by a factor of 2. No engineer wants that on his record, right? But I think there are places where we understand the fault well enough that we should incorporate that into decision making. So I'm fully convinced that we understand the Alaska subduction zone. Let's take that as an example, that just by basic physics, if we've had the earthquake 50 years ago, and those earthquakes occur every 5,000 years, even given the uncertainty, I would feel very comfortable not designing for that earthquake. So I don't think it's gonna occur in the lifetime of that building. But the assumption is that you understand the fault, you know when the most recent earthquake was, because you need to know that, obviously, and you need to have a good handle on how often those earthquakes, occur. So not me, but I'm probably one of the most vocal people that have been telling USGS, the engineer needs to know a real-time estimate of the hazard. Let him make the decision. We may not embed it in the code. Let him make the decision on what he wants to tell the building owner what to do. Okay? So, I have a lot of clients in Utah along the west side front. Our building code in Salt Lake City, our US building code, national hazard maps, they don't take into account that our last earthquake in Salt Lake City was 1,400 years ago. And when we look at the last 6 earthquakes, they occur every 1,400 years. Guess what? We're gonna see a big earthquake in Salt Lake City. And I chair the working group on Utah earthquake probabilities, and we have given a fairly high probability Salt Lake City is going to have a big earthquake in the next 50 years. Me as a building owner, I'd like to know that, right? Because I may make the decision, okay, we're gonna have a big earthquake in the next 50 years. Maybe you want the building to be standing up after that earthquake. So it may not get embedded in the building code, but we should do the research so we can tell the engineering community what the actual hazard is, rather than hazard that is devoid of any consideration when it was researched.
And I agree with the Salt Lake City example. I worry about the assumptions with the Anchorage example.
Okay, fair enough.
Just to be cognizant of everybody's time, I think we've got time for like 1 or 2 more questions. I saw one.
Please feel free to tell me.
I just want to make sure that the students have a chance to ask any questions, but I do have a question that may benefit them when they're going to their first job. So any questions from students first? There's not, then I'll just ask. So thanks again, Ina, that's great. I appreciate your vast experience. You know, all these hazard projects that I've worked on and you've worked on, they're extremely multidisciplinary. And so I was just wondering if you could comment really quickly and, you know, in your practice, how you, how it all works using, you know, the geologist can tell us about crustal motions, the seismologist can tell us about earthquake frequencies, magnitudes, the geologist can tell you where the best breweries are. And then the engineers do all that. So it all comes together. So I was just wondering if you could comment on how the whole hazard assessment works with a big group of different experts.
So, on my group, so again, what I do is I do seismic hazards. I quantify the seismic hazards, and then I tell the engineer, okay, you should design the building to this level of ground shaking, this characteristic ground shaking, etc. So, doing seismic hazards is very, collaborative, has to be collaborative, integrative approach, because in my group are earthquake engineers, basically geotechs, geologists, mainly paleoseismologists, structural geologists, and seismologists. You need all that information to solve seismic hazards because earthquakes involve all those disciplines. I don't have any geodesists. Who knows, I may hire a geodesist, but geodesy is becoming more and more embedded in seismic hazards. I think it's a relatively new field, and I don't know if we really understand what geodesy tells us in terms of deformation, but it is a growing field and one that will play an important part of us in terms of quantifying seismic hazards. But it takes, as one of my favorite first ladies used to say, it takes a village to do seismic hazards.
And for, oh, was there another one?
I do have another, that was such a nice note to end on, though, I sort of regret putting my hand up, but, that was great. I'm really sorry that I missed the beginning of your talk. I think we need like more of this type of discussion here at UNR. But I'm wondering about like, this kind of piles on Craig's point, is that these things like recurrence intervals and, you know, last great event, they depend very much on paleoseismic studies, which are better the more localized the fault is. So in the San Andreas system, where a lot of these techniques were developed, we re-rupture the same fault over and over. And the Basin range is kind of cool, and then we have this very distributed system where faults are actually passing hazard one to the other. So there are temporal patterns that we don't really have any hope of resolving. So I'm wondering, like, if we were to change the paradigm of how we're treating that, I mean, in addition to your time-dependent suggestion, like spatially relating faults one to the other, is there a way that we could ever build a seismic hazard model that would have a different kind of structure to it?
Okay, so we can only do time-dependent hazard if we understand well enough the behavior of the fault. So we need to do truly time-dependent hazard, we need to know when the last earthquake was, and we need to have a good handle on how often those earthquakes will occur. There's only a handful of faults in the Basin range in the US where we have that information. Cascadia, the subduction zone, one would argue it's San Andreas, but I think some of the faults in California. The Wasatch, we have that information. So when I'm talking about time-dependent hazard, I'm talking about faults where we have that information. But there are only a handful. But the handful that we have are the ones that we've studied the most. And the reason we've studied these faults the most is because they are the most impactful when it comes to risk. So by taking a step forward and doing time-dependent hazard on the San Andreas, I think we go a long ways to reducing risk. Now, there's another way of doing time-dependent hazard. And this is something that has just been evolving. We may have a fault where we don't know when the most recent earthquake was, where we don't know exactly what the recurrence level is. But the geologist can say, okay, we don't know exactly when the most recent earthquake was, but I can tell you based on the geomorphology, nothing's happened in the last 500 years. So we can take that, it's not truly time dependent, but we can take the fact, okay, we haven't had an earthquake along this fault for at least 500 years. It may have been much longer, but at least that's a piece of information that we can build into our national seismic hazard. Remember, our maps are designed for the lifetime of a building. Most buildings have a lifetime of 100 years. So even though, you know, nothing's happened on the fault for the last 500 years, that's still a good piece of information that we should build into the code, or at least produce a product that we can give to the engineers and to the building owners or the owners of infrastructure. More information than we give now, because right now we're not giving very much information. Other than the fact that we're giving them a map that we think has this probability, but it's not real time. So.
Thank you everybody for the questions. With that, we'll wrap it up. I want to give one more round of applause for Ivan. So as a thanks for your time, we here at UNR have a little gift for you. It's a nice coffee mug.
Oh, thank you.
There's a sticker on the inside.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you.
Keep the bag of everything.
Final housekeeping, there was a sign-in sheet going around. If you could sign it or get it back to me, I appreciate it. Also with all the students, we would like to take a group photo with Ivan. So, anyways, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Ivan. I gotta take off here.
Take care.